I can hear me. So welcome, everybody. This is the after lunch on the second day session. So stretch. Won't make you get up and do jumping jacks, but and we're going to talk about the really juicy topic of ethics, which may put some people to sleep, but I don't think this group, because we're dealing with these kinds of ethical issues and dilemmas in all of the work we're doing, especially in the field as well as in laboratory. So my name is Jessica Winters. I am a former board member of ACC&D and was with the ASPCA for 19 years, doing a lot of work in the field with shelters around the country. And I was also on the IACUC committee for the Gonacon study at Clowder that Amy Fisher did. So here's a major ethical quandary that was encountered by ACC&D. We were wanting to advance injectable and contraceptive for free-roaming cats. It was already successfully tested in laboratory animals, and then what's the next step? We want to do field trials of this product to test in a true target of free-roaming cats. So where should we get the cats? Some of these ethical dilemmas that were coming. Where should we get the cats? What kind of consent would be appropriate? We heard on the panel earlier today, Amy talked Craigslist to get cats. What are the necessary steps? What are the ethical considerations that need to be thought about in how we obtain cats for field studies? And what about the benefit to the animal, each animal that's in the study? Is that a consideration that we need to be taking? From a shelter's perspective, what are the ethical considerations in giving animals to research? What are the benefits for those animals? Are there benefits? How do we know? If it's research, we really don't know the outcome. We don't know what the risks necessarily might be. So there's a lot of ethical issues that come up in some of this stuff. As we designed this second project involving the dogs in Kenya, there was a pretty serious undertaking of the literature in how to make some of these ethical decisions, what kind of guidelines to follow, what questions should we be asking, when we found a really big gap. So today we're going to talk about what an ethical dilemma is, ACC&D's pathway to address resource gaps to aid in decision making, both not only for ACC&D but then as a catalyst and an incubator, how can we help other organizations when they're struggling with these issues. And then we'll talk a little bit about the project outputs for animal sheltering, guidance materials, and online tools, and some next steps that are coming down the pike. So let's just start with, so that we're all on the same page, what do we mean by an ethical dilemma? It usually involves making a choice about something. Do I euthanize this cat? Do I not euthanize this cat? The choices are mutually exclusive. I can't euthanize and not euthanize this cat, right? So I have to make a choice between two potentially unpleasant outcomes. Let's say this cat is terminal and suffering. The consequences of each choice result in something that I find morally unacceptable. And by morally unacceptable, I mean it's not fitting with my own personal moral code, right? And so we have a conflict. An ethical conflict, and we're having to figure out how we want to navigate. And so one of the things that we do oftentimes is look to some guiding principles for ethical decision making. And most organizations don't have them handy. Some ethical dilemmas that came up in some of the work that ACC&D was doing is, I think I've already mentioned, what if these what about shelters giving cats to a research study? Is it appropriate? What are the consequences? What are the risks if that cat could be rehomed in some other way? What happens if one of the cats gets pregnant? And now we're looking at some maybe moral conflict with aborting a litter of kittens versus allowing them to be brought into the world and then adding to some overpopulation issues, right, because of a study. So there are definitely some conflicts there. Choices have to be made. They're mutually exclusive. We don't really like the consequences of either one, but we're stuck. We have to make a choice. All right. So in looking at the ethics literature, there's a lot around laboratory research and the 3 R's, replace, refine, reduce. And it was helpful, but limited in its help. The work of ACC&D and others does not necessarily fit into this paradigm. So studies are taking place outside of the laboratory, oftentimes with pets. These interventions may provide risks and benefits, and do we want to make sure that we have benefits for sure for each animal that's in the study? There's a significant human component involved in field research, as we heard from our panels, just getting stakeholder buy-in, owner consent, informed owner consent. What does informed mean? The power differential that was mentioned earlier. So we found a lot of relevant concepts in human medicine and some in wildlife, but it took a lot of work to be able to access those and kind of try to make them fit with this need that ACC&D was having, and I think a lot of other researchers and folks doing field intervention. So in talking with a lot of people out there in the field, really we're identifying there was this gap. There is this need for some kind of ethical guidelines or ethical framework that people can use, organizations can use when they are designing a program, and then reflecting back on that program. So in a think tank was convened in February of 2017. We had about 24 participants from 5 different countries that were brought together. It was hosted at the Institute for Human-Animal Connection in the Graduate School of Social Work in Denver. And I think there are a number of, we have, Joyce, 11 people from the think tank that are here. Roger Haston, Katie Parker, Michael Barrett from the ASPCA. We had funders that were there at the think tank that we actually got involved in the actual process. We didn't want them to just come and observe. We wanted their input, which was super helpful in terms of getting even a funder's perspective on some of the things that we needed to be thinking about. So, group photo of the folks that were there. I just saw Lisa Moses poke her head in. There she is. Roger was there. Sarah. Got a number of people that were here. Amy, Kevin Morris, Amy Fisher. So, it's interesting. This laptop is a slide behind what's just FYI. Okay. So, what happened in the course of those 2 days is we identified 3 major areas where more development and thinking and needed to happen in terms of ethical decision making in the field. One being in the animal sheltering industry in the U.S. and Europe. Another was in veterinary clinical trials and novel treatments, and the third sort of bucket was around international welfare initiatives, global scope. So we focused on those areas after the first day and came out with 3 projects to move forward. The second 2 projects got combined into one, and Joyce will be describing that one for you. The first project was on introducing this concept and thinking more about this concept of moral distress in the sheltering industry. And by moral distress, what we mean is being in a position where we feel we know what the right thing is to do. Our own moral compass tells us this is the correct action, but we're in a situation where we don't have the resources or the institutional support or the decision authority to make that decision. And so we're now following through on something that we may not necessarily agree with. It doesn't sit comfortably for us. So we've got that kind of a challenge happening. It was a term that was coined initially in the 80s in the nursing field, what nurses were dealing with in terms of what doctors want, what patients want, what family members want, what they want, and trying to navigate some pretty heavy-duty situations and decisions. So the first project that we worked on was creating a workshop. We wanted to pilot a workshop to introduce the concept of moral distress and also ethical decision-making, doing an ethical analysis in a shelter environment. So we had Dr. April Steele from Denver Dumb Friends was at the think tank and volunteered her staff and her team to participate in this pilot workshop. So we did that in December of 2017. Dr. Lisa Moses was co-facilitator with me on that project. And I'll show you what happened. So it was a half-day workshop, navigating everyday dilemmas in the animal shelter. And what we know when we're dealing with an ethical dilemma is that every answer is right, and every answer has some kind of unacceptable consequence that we're also struggling with. So we had Lisa Moses and myself facilitating that workshop, bringing content expertise and facilitation design to the table. 33 staff participating from Dumb Friends from a whole variety of departments, people in foster care, in admissions, in their medical department, in their behavior department who participated. Also with varying degrees of longevity at the organization. Some folks were fairly new to the organization. Some had been around a long time. One of the things that we did was a pre-workshop survey and asked them to tell us about some situations that they found. Either they agreed with the decision that was made or they disagreed with the decision that was made, and why. And we used that as fodder for the workshop. We incorporated those examples into the training. So our learning objectives for that workshop were identifying what an ethical dilemma is. It's not a term that's used a lot, but we're in it every day up to our eyeballs. It's amazing how pretty much every time we turn around, we're facing some kind of ethical dilemma. So we wanted to get that introduced to the group. We wanted folks to become acquainted with the concept of moral distress. We didn't go too deeply into it, but we wanted to see how is this resonating. When we describe it, what are people's reactions? Are we seeing sort of a nodding of heads and an aha moment of, oh my gosh, yes, I can relate to that or not? And we then looked at competing ethical obligations from the scenarios that they provided us. And then Dr. Moses helped walk us through an ethical analysis, which is not easy. Not easy. Through that, applying ethical principlism to a shelter dilemma, which is ethical principlism being used often in animal welfare ethics. So the outcomes from that workshop, and we debriefed with April Steele, Denise Parker from Denver Dumb Friends, Sloan from Institute of Human-Animal Connection, Joyce and Val and Lisa and I. Kind of, what did we see happening? What was going on? Where do we think we were hitting the mark, and where do we need to go further? And there were two but very distinct themes that came out of that. One is there's definitely a need for some ethics 101 in the animal sheltering industry. It's really fascinating because when you think about it, the work is driven by ethics. Right? We're passionate about doing no harm to animals, improving their welfare, et cetera. Yet there are very different paradigms that people are coming at it from, and there's no discussion of that that's actually happening in any sort of formal way or even an informal way. And what ends up happening is we get a lot of conflict between people over conflicts of sort of ethical values that they're not even knowing is happening. They're not naming it. So we want to increase animal welfare ethical literacy at the national level was an outcome they identified from that, and finding and developing tools or paradigms for ethical decision, which Joyce will talk about in a minute. And then the other concurrent theme that was emerging, or trajectory, was really addressing this issue of moral stress, moral injury, that's happening for people working in the field who are facing ethical dilemmas and moral dilemmas all the time, aren't able to name them as such, but are carrying them throughout their work. So increasing awareness of moral stress, distress, and injury at the staff and organizational level, and even potentially having ethics committees within organizations and even within communities, and finding and developing training and awareness for self-care. So with that, I will turn it over to Joyce to talk about the other two projects that came out of the think tank.
Thanks a lot. This topic really resonated with me, having been in the animal welfare field for now over 25 years and working with organizations at the national and the local level and seeing times when projects fell apart because people brought very different, valid views to what was right and what was wrong. And even organizations have fallen apart. And when that happens, we don't serve the animals as well. And oftentimes, fabulous people can be driven from our field. And there are key words out there that provoked this. So you say no-kill, you say TNR, and those both have people feeling very adamantly on different sides that are coming at it with real concern for the animals. And as ACC&D started getting more involved in field work, maybe I'd been theoretical a bit, in our work for too long, but I started feeling like, we're so well-intentioned. Our actions have got to, will be fabulous. But I realized you quickly step into lots of ethical challenges in the field, and it reiterated how impressed I am with veterinarians in general and people in our field doing field work to help animals, because we are at the cross-section of people who believe animals are vermin, and there's always these conflicting things that we are navigating. So as we started with our ACC&D projects, this one you've seen referenced a couple times at this symposium, was we started with these and started dealing with these ethical challenges. We reached out to a lot of people for guidance on this. We're kind of a little nerdy and academic on my staff, and so we tried to supplement our knowledge with published literature, and looked out to kind of do a literature review on what we could find, and we found really a scarcity of things for what we needed to do. So that led us to the think tank, and I will only add that we had a really wonderful array of people from the classical ethics, philosophers, field practitioners, and the 25 people who attended interviewed a lot of others in the field. Some of those people were also at this symposium to try to understand what they were grappling with in the field and what their decision-making process was like or their tools were like. And so we brought that with us to the think tank. And so the second and third projects came out of this, I'm going to talk about a bit separately and a bit together because we combined them going forward. One of those was feeling like we needed for our own work there was obviously a broader need for this than, ours is somewhat of a field, obviously, but the people we brought in were much more broadly focused on work in the field to help animals. I don't know if we've been clear about that. So this is not stories. It's work where you're out in the field. It might be actually something that a research study that you want to have good metrics, you want to publish those. It might just be a program that's brand new for your community, so you don't know how it's going to go, and you've got to explain something new and try it in the field. And that span was what we were looking for, because we tend to not have a lot of guidance doing brand new things. And if you think about it, there's a lot of emphasis on innovation now, for good reason, because we can only do better and new things if we innovate. But whenever you do that, it's something you've not tried before, and so there may be positive consequences, there may be negative consequences. And how do you prepare for that in advance and manage it as you go along? So, so the second project was really kind of the focus of many of the some of the leaders here. You will see James Yates, who's chief veterinary officer at the RSPCA, publishes a lot on veterinary ethics. Peter Sandow, who is at University of Copenhagen and has a wonderful site, which you must check out and can access through some of our stuff, AE, Animal Ethics Dilemmas, which actually takes you through some interactive assessing of your own values related to animals, so you can see how you compare to a colleague, because you come at it with a very different worldview, and that makes a difference in what you think should be done. And Dr. Vic Spain, who has recently left, but he's an epidemiologist working with Margaret at the time at the ASPCA. And so they felt like there really needed to be a guideline, some basic guidelines that took, if you remember that, we'll get to in a second, that borrowed from some of the other areas and helped create a customized set of guidelines for our field. So that's, and Julie Levy, who many of you may know, in our GonaCon study, this is her with doing some clicker training for the cats in our study, because they had to get monthly blood draws, and we wanted to make it as positive of an experience for them as possible. Part of what we navigated through in our ethical decisions. So the third group talked about was focused on international projects around the world where you're oftentimes trying to do good for animals in harsh circumstances, dealing with possibly different cultures and a lot of challenges that came with that. They were focused on how could you create something that was highly practical and adaptable and accessible to people working in the field, at the leadership level, making plans for those projects, actually also kind of at the field level, and how could it be really, how would it be presented so that it could be used most effectively? And you'll see several people in this group. Include Kate, who I think is in this room, right? There she is at the back, was a real leader in this area, Director of Global Community Animal Welfare from IFAW. Deepa Balaram with GARC, Global Animal Alliance for Rabies Control. And Dr. James Serpel, like purple, out of UPenn. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these. So this is kind of so we were aiming with Project 2 and 3 to kind of fill gap, start the role for filling that gap. Project 2 would design kind of these customized guidelines you see that would draw from the valuable parts of laboratory animal ethics, because there's certainly a lot of relevant things there. It would draw from wildlife ethics. Wildlife are existing adjacent to communities, adjacent to the environment. There's a lot of applicable stuff there. And human medical ethics. You look at people who are bringing different treatments for HIV to highly burdened areas of Africa, and they're needing to decide who's the control group. Is it okay to be a control group? What do they get? Some of the same parallel issues that we had with this topic. As these crystallize coming out of the think tank, I want to acknowledge the William and Charlotte Parks Foundation, which has given us now a second grant to continue this, and Dr. Lou Tasker, who's UK-based, who I must acknowledge because she is the architect and author of many of the things I am going to be presenting today and unable to be with us. Also, my colleagues Valerie and Susan, who have been very, very involved. The first thing we ended up doing is actually publishing an article in a special issue of Animals. It was actually a special issue dedicated to ethics, which was perfectly timed, and came out this January. It's open. You can get it and read it. What it really did was establish in a more referenced literary and undoubtedly articulate way than I am establishing it. It established what that gap is. This is good because it's a peer-reviewed publication that kind of gave credence to the fact that indeed this is a gap. And you can see from some of the comments here, we've had a really strong download from over 70 different countries, I think now. I didn't quite know there were that many countries. And some really good feedback on the fact that, yeah, this is an issue for us working in the field. So the audience for this, it's meant to be for people who are involved in field research, or as I mentioned, just innovation involving dogs. Essentially, oftentimes these are to cats. Oftentimes, as in rabies control program, they are also about public health and helping people, and there may be conflicts within that. These are kind of the different audiences that we think are within that bucket. And also, as we realized, there are projects that are exempt from any kind of formal review, formal ethical review. Many of them in our field do not go through that. And there are projects that go through ethical review, an IACUC or an Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, or an IRB, an Institutional Review Board for People Studies, that go through that but aren't really well equipped to deal with the range of issues that we face. So it's meant to be a resource for those as well, to see if they're looking at these issues with the breadth that they need to. In our think tank, the wonderful thing is our project funders were really, and all of them said, hey, can we come? Can we send a couple people? And we were getting together this like peanut gallery of viewing funders, and we stepped back and we said, these guys have incredible breadth in terms of kind of studying what's working and what's not in the field. They are incenting people to measure their results. We need to involve them in the dialogue. So we integrated them, and they were amazing. And they all told us that we would like to have a tool for our grantees to consider in advance the ethical questions around what they're doing, and we'd like a way that we could look at our grantees to say, what are the things that they should be doing in advance of getting started. So, jumping in. So, since that time, we have developed what we call the guidance document. It is out for review right now with many of the people involved in that original think tank. And what I'm going to show you today is the structure of that. We have been blessed to be able to bring this to life a little bit better with the support of Kate at IFAW and Nancy Barr, who is a wonderful e-learning specialist, who's kind of laid some things out so that I'll show you document parts of it, and I'll show you how that might look in a more interactive online way. And again, this is preliminary. We are hoping to work with Nancy further on this because we loved it, and go from there. So what you're seeing here, time to use my little thing, is I can do this online, so I'll go through kind of quickly with this one. So this is kind of the structure of the guidance document, and what you have up top is there's an overall guidance document, and then that leads to ethical toolkits that give even more practical advice in how and tools and resources for you to look into those areas. This is divided into 3 areas. Part of it is that foundation for decision making, that ethical principles and ethical review. And that's to really part of the ethical literacy that Jesse described, is we're not used to talking in terms of ethical terms. What is the risk and the benefit to these audiences? What is our ethical perspective on that? And ethical review helps you determine, is what I'm doing something that should actually go through a more formal ethical process, and what do those look like? Where might I find them? Or is this something that's informal will do? The part on this side is the various stakeholders that are typically involved, and their toolkits to help you better look at that stakeholder. So, you see here what we saw before. You've got the animals themselves, you have owners, and then you have the communities and who else is decision makers around the project or could be affected. And in the middle, you've got some what we call cross-cutting themes because it's things like conflict of interest. How do you navigate conflicts of interest that come up? Things about consent, which come up. Oftentimes we'd be thinking about owner's consent, but there's even the concept of, how do you have inferred consent by the animal themselves? Who's the agent to determine if this is something that's in the animal's best interest? And monitoring, which is so important and brings its own issues. So here's kind of a view of what this looks like, and this is kind of in a PDF form. You can kind of see the outline of it. My text there. Here's the portion on the stakeholders. I pulled out this chart from the stakeholder analysis to be able to kind of see it a bit better. So what this does is it helps you actually go through in an intervention that you're doing, what are the different stakeholders involved? You've got the aid of those different toolkits. But for each of them, you can kind of look at, what's their interest in what you're doing? What effect do they have on what you'll be doing? What effect does what you're doing have on them, either positive or negative? If there's risks to that, what's the severity of those risks? And what are the action steps you need to take to either assure the benefits or mitigate the risk? And kind of be able to go through each of those helps you have a better navigate if you're ethically pursuing this. What I should probably say on the part of the way it's organized too takes you through what are the good steps to take when you're planning something. What are things you want to do, like when you're mid-course? How often do things go exactly as we plan them? How often do thorny issues you never anticipated come up in the field? How do you deal with that midstream? And what are the important reflective things you should do after, as you're wrapping up, as you're monitoring this, to look back and see what you could have done differently? I won't go back since it's recording, but case studies are a really important part of this. And I will, at a certain point, if there's time, I will read you one of the there's some case studies that are integrated into this tool. And right now there are ones that are around community dog management internationally. There are ones around TNR in an area that, in a way that could be U.S., could be elsewhere. And then there's one around kind of a new veterinary product clinical trial and things that might come up. And each of those case studies is a worked example in the toolkits to let you see how somebody else worked through this. Ellie, Kate, my staff colleagues are here. Anyone want to Roger, anyone who was at that want to pipe up with anything or mention something I've undoubtedly forgotten or not mentioned? I stunned you into silence.
Well, Joyce, I'm not sure that I have anything to add. You did a fantastic job. Thank you. I just want to reiterate what Joyce has said, that I think all of us who were at the think tank were incredibly grateful to ACC&D for seeding this and for being willing to kind of take the burden of incubating this idea, even though it certainly has a far wider remit than I think you really envisioned. And all of us who were there having ideas about the need for ethics in this field beyond just the application of a non-surgical sterilization. We're incredibly grateful for the platform and the opportunity to think about this. And I would encourage anybody who is involved in setting up new projects of any kind, because as we started to think about the application of non-surgical sterilization or any kind of new treatment, we found it difficult not to walk further and further down the line and say, well, look, there's so much in this field that we do that hasn't been tested and that it has impacts on wider sets of stakeholders than we had originally envisioned. And this tool just got bigger and bigger, and I think all of us can look around and think about the ways that we wrestle with ethical dilemmas when we set up projects, when we're trying to impact the welfare of animals or the welfare of communities that interact with animals. So I just wanted to say thank you for presenting this. IFAW is certainly happy to play a role in that and continue to beta test it. But if there is broader interest, I would love to see this being tested and more feedback. And maybe at the next forum we have that next step. We have a tool, everybody's using it, and we have a lot more to say about it. So thank you, Joyce.
Any questions for myself or others that were involved in this? I will admit, if you were in the marking presentation before lunch, I am the one that colored the inside of my cat and dog's ears with a UV marker. So, it's, as I said, comes up like once a week, it seems.
Did you go through an ethical review process with your animals before?
With my colleagues, with that pen poised, like, right? Yeah. Is it okay? No questions. Anybody possibly interested in beta testing this once there's something to work through with your work? When will it be done? God, I don't know, Margaret. That's a good point. Yeah. Now that we're nearing being done with the symposium, we'll get back and have a timeline for that. Just to get another infusion of funding from the Parks Foundation to do that. So, and we are very eager to start integrating the good input from the think tank participants. So, I guess I would hope that within, I don't know, is Val or Susan in here? What do you think, Susan?
Yeah, I think the more people we can have who are interested in this project, the better. It's definitely something that we need to have people just test it and try it out and see how it works in the field. And I think we're just going to keep the momentum going.
Yeah, and the guidance written material, which is not yet formatted into the easy, quizzes and whatnot, be probably available in its revised form in a month or two, because it's quite far along to read and give input to. And we'll have to see about the next steps we want to make sure we've got that nailed with the our stakeholders in this project before we start figuring out how to make it interactive and accessible. The other thing that we have solicited and would love to hear from you is, as you had case studies of like things that have been ethical dilemmas for you, is to let us know about those. The case study I gave you was kind of nicely solved, and they're wrapped up with a bow, but the critical things for this are really some of the challenges that you're in the middle of facing, and how do you dissect them to determine what's the best. Remember, these are situations oftentimes where there's no exact right answer. There is what's right for you. And this is less about providing the answer than it is providing a method for you with your decision makers, whether it's your board or your department or your organization, to think through and say, what path forward are we happy with? What makes sense for us, and have we given it the right kind of attention? That's what the intention is. Because a lot of these, there really aren't right answers. There are just pathways that are the right choice for us, given good deliberation. Yes, Ellie. Oh, we should. Yes. Do we have a mic?
Okay, Joy. Apologize. I didn't listen to the beginning, so I might have missed something. But in the UK, we have, as a government agency, but also if you work at the university, you have a very prescriptive process to work on animals. You can't dream about working on animals until you have filled something like 40-page documents that goes to the Home Office, where you justify everything, including your life. And then you have to go through the ethical review process and again justify every single step and use the 3 R's, replacement, reduction, and I forgot the third one. So is it something similar going on in the States, or are we a bit mad and overdoing it?
I would love to comment on that and then ask Ellie, coming from the same side of the pond, to do that. I want to say up front that We found a lot more progressive thinking and content in the UK than in the US on some of this. So kudos to you guys. This is not attempting to be the really stringent review that you're referring to, but it's and we worked a lot on the need for this with James Yates, the UK, others. This is more intended for where there are projects that don't necessarily require review, or there are projects that really what they're doing is not as well fitted to what that review provides. So it's not intending to try to add on like the 50 to 60th page onto your 40-page thing, but it's meant to try to, it's kind of natural that things have not been customized for our work in the field with dogs and cats, because that's kind of specific, right? I mean, it's what our lives are about, but it is kind of specific. So this is really just saying, how do we, as opposed to our experience where we had to cobble it all together for ourselves, how do we get something that is a much better match? Ellie, did you want to add anything to that, to the part?
I don't know if I can add anything up to that particular point, in that I'm not as experienced as you, Gio, on actually going through the ethical review board process in the UK or the US. Lou did note that when she was looking at both, that the UK one is definitely more demanding than over here. Sorry. I kind of wanted to make a bit of a plea that this guidance can set you up to approach an ethical review, understand some of the ethical constructs you should be considering as you look at the work that you want to do and the different choices that you've got. But it should go to a proper review board. Some of you from within academia, government institutions and research institutions will have access to ethical review boards. Those of us from the NGO community don't have that access. So a little bit of a plea to you. This is one of the barriers to us doing this really well, is that we are now struggling to try and pull together or access proper ethical review boards that can cope with our kind of, I guess, fairly unique field environments, community-based, and so on. So if any of you have any ideas, or offers indeed, to help us with this as a barrier, I think, moving forwards.
Yeah, and as we aim to publish more of our work and our innovation for the credibility that provides, we will need that for publishing. So it's a path. It opens a pathway for us to have that as well. We're at time, but I encourage any of you who are intrigued or appalled or any of your impressions to please share and let us know, and feel free to come up to me personally or anybody who's been identified as involved on this. And I appreciate your time and attention for this hour.